So a happy Hanukkah to everyone. It's good to see you, although I can only see 4 people on my screen. I'm Stephen Bayar. I am the director of JSurge. And with me is Rabbi Julie Schwarzwald, who is our director of JMorim, which is a branch of JSurge dedicated to bringing Jewish educational materials and Jewish educators together. And so we are here from our different locations, and we're going to be talking about Hanukkah. With us also are our wizard in residence, Joe Strassler, who is in charge of our tech, and Glenn Rosenkrantz, who is our media specialist. And I'd like to welcome everyone. There are people from all over the United States here. The format of our talks is usually Julie and I will have a conversation for about 20 to 25 minutes. And at that point, then we'll open it up to questions. Although if you have a question or a comment, you can put it in the chat on the side. And if we can look at it, we will, and respond to it, we will immediately. If not, we'll get to it by the end. But we do hope you're going to have questions, because we're going to be talking about issues that are going to bring up a lot of questions. So we are JSurge. We are devoted to bringing Judaism to Jews, and we do this through a modicum of efforts. We do a fee for service for those people who are looking for rabbis, cantors, and educators to help them find their Judaism. And we also do a lot with Tikkun Olam. And our Tikkun Olam work of fixing the world is we do work in El Paso, we do work in Israel, we do work all over the United States. So what is JSurge? I've just told you. And now I'm going to start with what we're talking. Without using a politically loaded term or using a politically loaded term, let's talk about the fake news of Hanukkah. What we all know about Hanukkah is that the Jews fought against the Greeks. The Greeks had conquered the Jerusalem, and they had taken over the temple. They were instituting sacrifices that were problematic, pigs and other things in the temple in Jerusalem, and they killed a lot of Jews. And so what we've learned is that Judah Maccabee and his father Mattathias and the other Maccabees, not to be confused with the Maccabees, which if you know about them, you know that they're a great singing group, but the Maccabees defeated the Greeks, they cleansed the temple, and then when they went to light the menorah, they could only find pure oil that would last for 1 day. And the miracle was it lasted for 8 days, and therefore we have 8 days of Hanukkah. That is what we are taught, but that's not the story of Hanukkah. The books of Maccabees, which we have in the Apocrypha, which are the books that didn't make it into the Bible, the books of Maccabees written by the Maccabees talk about a civil war of Jew versus Jew over who was going to become the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And one group were Hellenizers, they were assimilationists, they were allied with the Greek Syrians who were in control of Jerusalem at that point. And the other were the more traditionalists, perhaps led by Mattathias. And the civil war broke out. The Syrian Greeks step in on the side of the Hellenists. Mattathias leads a rebellion. Judah recaptures the temple. He cleanses it. And then he proclaims that since Sukkot that year, that 8-day holiday of Sukkot that comes right after Yom Kippur, could not be celebrated because the Jews weren't in control of Jerusalem, that they were going to celebrate Sukkot in Kislev, or in what we would now call December. And so for 8 days, they kindled fires perhaps, but they celebrated Sukkot. And then Judah makes the proclamation that from that point on, Sukkot will be celebrated in Kislev, where Hanukkah is now. And the reason Hanukkah is 8 days is because Sukkot is 8 days. There's no mention of oil. There's no mention of the menorah. In fact, there's no mention for almost 600 years until the Gemara comes in and asks the question, why do we celebrate Hanukkah? And then it goes on to talk about the oil. That is the first time the oil shows up. Now, the Maccabees set up a dynasty called the Hasmonean dynasty that eventually became more assimilated than their predecessors. And from there, it all goes to hell. So here we are in a December dilemma. The history of Hanukkah is very different from what we celebrate today. And the question, one of the questions we ask is, how tied are we to the historical record as opposed to how the tradition changed everything about the original story for its own needs? Julie.
So I'm going to talk from an educator standpoint because that's what I am. In preschool, we teach that it was the miracle of the oil, and that's why we have 8 days. As our students get older, we teach them that it was, in fact, a military victory, but truthfully, they still had God on their side, and that's why they were able to be victorious. And then for our teens and our adults, we do talk about the fact that it was a Jewish civil war, and we go into maybe the Maccabees were not the role models that we all want, and certainly those of us in progressive liberal Judaism may not feel quite comfortable with, the Maccabees once we've learned all about them. But truthfully, I'm not sure any of it matters. I feel Hanukkah, with all of the revisionist history that we have put into it and with all of the different elements of it, just gives us an amazing opportunity to teach about all sorts of different things. So one of the questions we can ask is why? Why did the rabbis over the ages feel a need to change the story? It was a military victory. Why did they feel the need to bring in the miracle of the oil, to bring in God? And why did we come back to the idea? It literally says they brought lulav and etrog, into the temple to observe Sukkot. So it becomes a really interesting case study of how Judaism evolves and how our text understanding evolves and how our commentary evolves and how we've layered that on top of it. And I think that that's a really interesting part to have a conversation about. We know that none of it was written down until 200 years after it happened. So we're already talking about, nobody who was there is giving us an accurate record of what really went on, and it's all interpretive. But we also know that when they de-emphasized the military victory, it was because we were exiled and we were strangers in a strange land, and maybe talking about overthrowing the mighty who were in control might not have been the wisest political move. So maybe the miracle of the oil is a better way to go. And that's another fascinating piece to talk about. I think that one of the beautiful things about Hanukkah being 8 days is we have multiple opportunities to talk about all sorts of different things. So, for me, I always like to bring in the women. And we know that their voices are not often counted and not often heard. And for Hanukkah, we can talk about Hannah, and we can talk about Judith, and we can talk about the celebration of Chag Habanot and be able to introduce all of those. For me, I don't know that it matters what the actual history was. We change history all the time, and we reinterpret it and we share it, and it's revisionist in everything that we do. So, Buber said that a miracle is our ability to receive God's presence. And if we can do that by believing in a military victory, or by believing in the oil lasting 8 days so that they had time to purify more, or recognizing that the fight of the Maccabees was to preserve our ritual and our tradition, each of those can be a miracle in their own right. Heschel talked about viewing the world through radical amazement and finding the miracles in everyday life. So for me, Hanukkah is here. It's at the darkest period of the year, and we are bringing light into our lives. It's a very family and home-centered holiday. So if we can look at it with radical amazement, I think that the miracles are there everywhere. And I don't get too hung up on what the actual story was or why we are talking about it or not talking about it. Steve?
It's the presence. Let's be honest. It's the presence. I guess, since Julie, you quoted Heschel and Buber, so I'm going to name drop also, and I'm going to start with John Wayne. So there's a movie called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And if you're not familiar with the movie, it's a great movie. But the bottom line is, it all hinges on the fact that Jimmy Stewart killed Lee Marvin. And then Jimmy Stewart goes on to be a big senator and a big politician and everything. And he comes back when the John Wayne character dies, and he's reliving all of this, and he feels guilty because he became very powerful and popular because he killed a bad guy. And then he finds out that he didn't shoot the person, John Wayne did. So his entire life, his reputation is based on a lie. And the newspaperman who is interviewing him hears all of this and then tears up the story. And the Jimmy Stewart character says, "What are you doing?" And the newspaperman, the editor, says, "When the facts contradict the legend, print the legend." And that's what Julie seems to be saying. And I have to admit, to a certain extent, I have to agree with her. I loved Hanukkah growing up. Hanukkah was all about the presents. What's not to love? Presents, latkes, oil, eating all of this stuff. The biggest argument was who was going to blow the dreidel, or was it sour cream, or was it applesauce? All of these things. But more importantly, it's a celebration. And we don't have enough celebrations in our tradition. Yes, we have other holidays, and the holidays are fun, and the holidays are meaningful, but Hanukkah was just delight. And as I was growing up, my parents made sure that Hanukkah was a very important holiday because it was coming up against Christmas. And then when I had young children, we made sure that they enjoyed Hanukkah. Even though they were in day school or yeshiva, we made sure that that was a time that they looked forward to. And as they got older and they went their own way, and I found myself in an empty nester, Hanukkah lost some of its importance because, after all, we know that there's a disconnect between what really happened and what we do. And if it's going to be a holiday where we celebrate things with the children and we don't have the children with us, it becomes hard. And all of this was going on. And then I went to the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union. And I was there during Hanukkah. And we were visiting refuseniks, Russian Jews who had applied to leave the Soviet Union and had been refused, and then they were persecuted. And we were visiting refuseniks on Hanukkah. And so we would visit them at night. And one night of Hanukkah, one of the refuseniks turned to us and said, "I'd like to light Hanukkah candles with you." Now, my companion was also a rabbi, but we weren't traveling as rabbis. And so we said, sure. It was like the fourth or fifth night of Hanukkah. And he opened the oven, which was hot, and he took out half of a potato that had a hole cut into it on the top. He put the candle, one candle, into that top, and he lit it, and we did the blessings really quickly, and then he blew out the candle and put the potato back in the oven. And we turned to him and we said, what is this all about? And he said, it's against the law to light Hanukkah candles. So we can't have a menorah, it's against the law. So what we do is we make a menorah out of potatoes. And so if the KGB knocks on our door, which they will, we then throw the potato back in the oven, and that's going to be our dinner. And I realized that while Hanukkah may not have meant that much to me, it was probably the most important holiday of their lives because it is religious freedom. We take Hanukkah for granted, but out in the hinterland, where there is little Jewish presence and Christmas or hatred are more the norm, it may be the most important holiday we have. And when we talk about whether it's history, whether we're going to honor history or not, Max Dimont wrote in a seminal book in the early 60s called Jews, God, and History. He asks a question at the very beginning of the book, which is, if I could prove to you that Moses never existed or Abraham never existed, what would it do to your faith? And the answer should be nothing, because Jews are not a historical people. History is part of who we are, but it's not what we are, and it's not our identity. So therefore, and most of liberal Judaism is founded on the possibilities that the history that we know may not be completely true. So why do we hold Hanukkah to a different standard? why can't we just celebrate what it has become and recognize how important it is? Print the legend. Julie.
So like you, we were the only Jewish family in my elementary school district, which meant that, yes, all of our neighbors put up their Christmas lights every year. And so my mother embraced decorating the house for Hanukkah. Hi, Mom. And it was part of what we did. We had glitzy decorations. We put them up. We put them in the window. We had the Hanukkah in the window. And yes, that was absolutely part of it. And we went to school, and we were delighted to get presents on 8 days instead of one. So it was a strong part of our Jewish identity, and very much more so than Sukkot. So I agree. I agree with the importance of Hanukkah, and I agree with all of that. It is, and of course, the fried food and the chocolate gelt, right? There's no getting away from that. It's a great excuse for all of us to put aside caloric counting for the moment. Somebody wrote an article about this year being a really crucial year to make sure that our children feel appreciated at Hanukkah. That, you know, they have been working just as hard about as everybody else in terms of making sure getting online and being able to function and going to school and checking in on their own social emotional health and well-being. That to really give Hanukkah to our children and grandchildren this year is so tremendously important. And, you know, the fact that every culture has a holiday of light right now, we know that. And so this is our holiday of light. And if nothing else, it is bringing light to the darkness as the days grow shorter, as we hunker down, all the more so in pandemic land, and being able to have those moments of light and warmth and family together are so important. As a U.S. history teacher, one of my favorite stories to teach is the Midrash that George Washington was out one night walking among the colonial troops, and he saw a soldier who was lighting his Hanukkah. And he said, "What is this all about? Tell me the story." And the soldier explained how the Maccabees, the few, had triumphed against the mighty, the Syrian Greeks. And the story goes that George Washington learned about guerrilla warfare from this Jewish soldier and turned the tide completely, realized that the colonists could fight against the British army in the same way, and ultimately was triumphant. So Hanukkah is everywhere. It stretches everywhere. It has meaning for everything. And yeah, I think it is well worth celebrating. It is well worth honoring. And for me, I love the opportunity to change the narrative as people grow older and as they are able to have a more nuanced understanding of it.
At this point, we'd like to open it up if anyone has questions or comments to either put them in the chat room or to just make sure that we unmute you. And I believe that many of you're going to be unmuted, and you can just ask your questions.
I'm going to go ahead, just from the tech side, I'm going to go ahead and give everyone the ability. You can go ahead and unmute yourselves to answer.
And of course, Mom mentioned that, yes, Mom was responsible for making latkes for the entire neighborhood and for us to be able to educate and share our Judaism with everyone.
Can we get one thing straight before we continue? Okay, we're not going to have a latke debate on what makes a good latke. The bottom line is you fry anything, it's going to be good. So let's at least agree. So no recipes, please. Thank you. Marion.
Yeah, when my daughter was about 8 years old, she had a friend down the block who was Christian, and they never knew any Jews. And all of a sudden, I'm talking to the mother, and the mother says to me, "My daughter Sharon wants to become Jewish. She wants to celebrate, excuse me, she wants to celebrate Hanukkah." I said, "That's because Anna gets presents every night, 8 nights. So it goes to the point."
Yes. Although I would argue that if Hanukkah is going to try to compete with Christmas, it's got to get better songs.
You have not been listening the last few years. So our 4-year-old class, as many of you may already have at home, made Hanukkah on tiles, right? Take the tiles, get the wing nuts, glue them on, and it makes something durable. I happen to have my 25-year-old sitting right here with me. They last forever. And we have 2 non-Jewish students who said, I need more candles. We gave them 2 candles to take home for the first night. They would like to light every night because they have been learning about it and they are excited about it. And by golly, they know the blessings. So
Well, hearing no,
You
Yeah.
can go ahead if someone does have a question. I know, David, you have a question. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
well, that's because David, you raised your hand.
Well, it's
That's okay. So
okay. I'm unmuted.
All right.
I was going to just ask, when you were saying that Hanukkah takes on a different meaning when the kids leave, is it the same in, because I've never been Christian, is it the same in Christian homes when the kids leave, you know, do they have the same Mishigas with presents under the tree and all the lights? And I would suppose that loses some meaning also, because the tree is really about family. And if family is not there, do you know more about it than I do? I mean, does that lose meaning also?
Joe, it says here that participants are not being allowed to unmute themselves. So,
Hold on. Let me see.
right, David from,
Oh, okay. All set. It should be fine now.
okay, David, from my
That
conversation,
worked. Oh, yeah. Okay.
from conversations with other members of clergy, it's exactly the same dynamic in the Christian community, that Christmas is so much about presents, and it's so much about the tree, and it's so much about family being together, that those adults who find themselves empty nesters do have exactly the same dynamic. And in fact, the depression in this time of year is even greater because Christmas is very much a holiday that is geared
Now
towards
it's
children.
Rabbi Bayar.
Yes.
I have heard that Joseph Campbell, who I've also heard was an anti-Semite, said some things are true even if they never happened.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, Max Dimont, for those of you who are familiar with Joseph Campbell, he writes a lot about myth, and it's an excellent point. Max Dimont actually does a riff on that point when he says, even if Moses didn't exist, we would have had to invent someone like him, because you need a character like Moses. And as an aside, while Hanukkah has a problematic history, halachically, according to the Jewish law, is changed by the Maccabees. In the book of Maccabees, we read several things, just to give a couple of examples. There are a group of religious zealots called Hasidim, not to be confused with the Hasidim of today. We're talking about over 2,000 years ago. They were Hasidim, and they fled to the wilderness of Judah and hid in caves away from the Syrian Greeks. And the Syrian Greeks found them, and it was Shabbat. And according to the books of Maccabees, the Hasidim refused to defend themselves because it was Shabbat, and they were massacred. When Mattathias and Judah hear about this, they then make a pronouncement which echoes through halachic literature going all the way forward. And that is, they have to defend themselves on Shabbat. Even though it might be considered breaking Shabbat, they are required to defend themselves. And that decision creates a very interesting tension within the tradition itself about the concept of saving a life versus being observant. And it ends up 600, 700, 800 years later with the rabbis coming very much on the side of saving a life trumps absolutely everything, no pun intended. But saving a life does take precedence over absolutely everything. And that's only one of the issues that the Maccabees bring up.
I kind of want to, it's Dave Hirschfeld. I want to address, I think, one of the things that's out there with regard to history. It's pretty well known. History is contextualized by the winners, and that's not uncommon, and it does change over time. But I do believe that it's important that we understand facts and that we can, to the extent possible. I know when you go back thousands of years, it's hard to ascertain facts with any certainty. But we live in a world today where social media is reinterpreting things that are not necessarily reinterpretable. There are facts, there are known facts, and things that we ought to be able to agree on. And I feel like even though Hanukkah has a long history and everything else, to the extent that there is truth to it, we should recognize that. It doesn't take away from the joy of Hanukkah, doesn't take away from the meaning of it in many ways, but it does. I think it's important that we do teach the history as we know it and as we learn. And if it changes, so be it. I would apply this across the board, quite honestly. If we lose our ability to state facts as facts, things that are observably true, objectively true, then I think that we do ourselves an enormous disservice, and we run a future risk that people will always be reinterpreting history to their advantage. And that could be things around pogroms. It could be things that are, not specific to Jewish people, but in fact, the world events that we are going through right now. So at the end of the day, I love Hanukkah. It's a great holiday for kids. It's an important one. We're empty nesters as well right now. And we still enjoy lighting candles. It still means a lot to us.
So I agree 100% on everything you said. My question for you is, which truth about Hanukkah would you teach then?
I think that people's capacity to understand complete truths is important to recognize. So, you're talking about a 4-year-old. In fact, it's not possible to go into nuances. But if we were talking about the Second World War and what gave rise to that, it is important that you actually get into it. And as people get older and they are able to process more complicated and nuanced types of stories, you teach the whole thing, and you teach both sides. You teach what happened. We live in a world today where, in fact, there are parallels to the 30s and 40s. And, there's an adage, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think that we need to learn from it.
So one of the greatest examples of what you're talking about, David, is this reinterpretation of history occurs in the late 1800s, because when the early Zionists begin to preach and they're going back to the land, they're looking for role models. And for the previous 500 years, the Jews have lived in ghettos or shtetls. And because of the restrictions placed upon the Jews in Europe by the Christian kings, that they weren't allowed to bear arms, that they weren't allowed to defend themselves, that they were taxed and they were persecuted, the Zionists had no one to point to in the tradition. And within our tradition, in our history, we always look back to see if there's precedent for what we're doing. And the early Zionists looked at the Maccabees, and they reinterpreted Hanukkah to the point that they became the new Maccabees. And all of a sudden, Judah Maccabee becomes a very important character because the early Zionists had to defend themselves. And what Jews had defended themselves in the previous 1,000 years? And the answer was the Maccabees. Even though, by the way, our history shows that at the time of the Maccabees and well into the new millennium, Jews were feared, and Jews were part of mercenary bands that roved around the Mediterranean out for hire. One of the theories about why Judah was so successful was because we know that there were mercenary towns in the Middle East that were Jewish towns. Elephantine is the best example of this, and that all of these men came back to fight for Judah. It is so. Again, we see that history can be molded, and I do agree. We have to teach the history because we have to know how it is molded and blended.
Look at the Parsha right now. It's Joseph, right? I mean, we're just about to go. So we're just about to go through that one. And what are we doing? We're talking about slavery. Jews are actually trafficking in slavery, right? That's what's going on. And it's terrible. We've had wars, we've had slavery, we've had harlotry, we've had deception. But at the end of the day, we have an amazing story, and I think we need to be able to do that in a nuanced way, appropriate to people, that understanding and contextualize it. But if we whitewash, I don't want to whitewash things, and I don't want to tell lies per se, because I think it comes back to haunt us. I think that as we learn new truths and as we get smarter and more nuanced in our reasoning, we have to kind of appreciate that.
So when we talk about history, let me give you an example from the Parsha itself, because this Parsha always comes around Hanukkah. Does anyone remember Joseph had dreams, right? In the first dream, he has, they're binding sheaves, and he and his brothers sheaves are bowing down to him. And everyone thinks, oh, well, that's a presage of what Joseph's going to be important. And they get angry at the brothers or we condemn the brothers because Joseph was just recounting a dream. But he's not just recounting a dream. What he's doing is he's telling the brothers that when he becomes the leader, things are going to change. Remember, the brothers are shepherds. Joseph having a dream, saying to them, we're going to be binding sheaves, is Joseph saying to the brothers, when I'm in charge, you're going to be farmers. And the brothers, recognizing that, decide to get rid of him. I have to tell you, although I only have one brother, if my brother had a dream like that, I'd get rid of him too, in one way or another. And most of us would. But again, this is how, when we look at the text, we have to be very careful, because the texts are so, they're like, since Julie quoted Buber, let me quote a very famous Jewish scholar named Schreck. Schreck says, what's an ogre? An ogre's like an onion. He's got many layers. That's what Jewish texts are like. They're like ogres. They're like onions. They have many, many different layers.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I have an interpretation of Joseph's dreams.
Actually, when you said rabbi, Julie should have said yes also.
Okay, that's true. But I'm more familiar with you than with her. Joseph showed himself later on to be pretty astute statesman. And people say, well, but he wasn't really that astute when he was younger. I think he was astute. And he said, here I am, the youngest of 12 brothers. I'm going to get nowhere here in this household. I got to get out. But if I get out on my own, it's not going to be acceptable. I got to manipulate it so that I'm chased out or taken out. So he purposely tells the dreams so that he will be sold into Egypt.
That's extreme. That's extreme. But I can tell you, my brother might have done the same thing. So. So here we have what's interesting about Hanukkah, especially in the United States, is that while it has become commercialized, I'd like to go back to a point that both Julie and I made, or Rabbi Schwarzwald and Rabbi Bayar made earlier, and that is that when you grow up in a community where there are few Jews, Hanukkah becomes tremendously important. And almost to an extent that it becomes a weapon. Not in a bad sense, but it is a weapon. In other words, it allows us to express our Judaism in a positive way and to make a statement of independence. To a great extent, it's like putting a mezuzah on your door. And ironically, the way in which Hanukkah is celebrated, when I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, we were very proud of Hanukkah. We were a little nervous about Hanukkah, but we were very proud about Hanukkah as well, because it was a time for us to literally assert our Judaism in the face of Christianity. I don't know if many of you have come in contact with Christian missionaries before, but one of the big questions we would get in the Christian community was, okay, you're Jewish, but you believe in Jesus, right? And that's a common question in the United States outside of this tri-state area. we should not be so comfortable in this tri-state area. There are other tri-state areas. The one that I'm most familiar with outside of Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York is the tri-state area of Tennessee, Arkansas, and I believe Mississippi. That's also called a tri-state area. And in that area, celebrating Hanukkah is truly unique.
Rabbi, my late wife, Susan, occasionally would answer the door and there would be missionaries from the Seventh-day Adventists there. She invited them in, discussed the Bible with them, and showed them that she knew more about the Jewish Bible than they did. And they left, they left some literature and left, and that was the end of it.
Mel, I'm not sure what that has to do with Hanukkah, but thanks for sharing.
You were telling me about
Right.
reaction with non-Jews.
Right. Right. So again, let's talk about the dreidel.
Actually, because before you get to the dreidel, I think it's important also, you talk about Hanukkah. I grew up in an area that was also very non-Jewish. There were 2 Jews in my high school. I was one, and that I knew of at least. And you talk about Hanukkah as a weapon. I think that's true. And I think the other part that you've mentioned, and maybe Julia mentioned it as well, which is it's a sense of freedom. You talk about the Refusniks and Soviet Jewry and all. I think that's really important as well. But I also think it's important as a way of just acknowledging differentiation in some sense. It's interesting because I grew up in a fairly non-Jewish home, and people recognized me as Jewish, and inevitably during Hanukkah, they would come up and say, explain this story to me. We don't understand it. They were really eager to learn and to understand more. And it could be high holidays or Pesach or whatever, but in particular, Hanukkah was just positioned against Christmas. And so it was always like, so what is this thing? And so on and so forth. And it was really interesting because it was a teaching in a way. And I was not a very good teacher. I mean, I gotta tell you, I didn't know an awful lot. I learned more, because they asked questions than anything else. And maybe that was the signature, impact. But I took that as at least a sense of tolerance and a sense of, I don't know whether it's welcoming, but at least it was acceptance and acknowledgement. And I thought that was pretty powerful. I don't think I realized it. I realized it at the time, but it became more and more important to me as I got older.
David, your hand is up again. I don't know if that's on purpose.
It was. I had a couple of questions, or a statement and a question. We were talking before about what Hanukkah meant generally, and I think for me, this year means more than most other years, and it's because of the political crap that's gone on in the last whatever, name it. But without getting political, I felt for the first time in my life that my freedoms were possibly going to be taken away. And I realized we had a holiday for that. And it was coming up, and regardless of almost what happened, and we'll see tomorrow again, but almost what happened, that holiday would give me solace and make me feel whatever it made me feel, just good again, and maybe just normal again, and I needed that, and it felt really good to light the candles, not as a little kid, but as an adult, knowing fully what again they stood for me, which I think was a blessing that you don't get normally. So that's number one. And my question was, or is, one of the I have a zillion, as you know, but one of them is there any reason that we have, I know it's 8 days and you need a Shabbos candle, but where did that come from? Is there a reason? Is it mystical? They didn't just make that up. And if it's a story, the 8 days meant something. is there something more behind that, or it was just like, let's spin the dreidel and pick some numbers?
Rabbi Schwarzwald, you or me?
So I think Rabbi Bayar said it first, right? The 8 days come because the first thing they celebrated in the temple when they rededicated it was Sukkot, which was an 8-day holiday that they could not celebrate earlier. And therefore it was decreed that there would be this 8-day holiday beginning on the 25th of Kislev. Like that's spelled out in the text. There will be an 8-day holiday with the 25th of Kislev. And then at various points they say, and we will sing praises of Hallel, and that's why we do a full Hallel on Hanukkah. And like all of those pieces come in from there. So that's why the 8 days. I want to pose something, and then I want to take Renee's question, but because this is a good time since David brought it up, Erica Pearl has an article in the Los Angeles Times, and she has a proposal. We've talked about how Hanukkah has evolved over these many years. Her proposal is that we should start a new tradition, and we should add a 9th night of Hanukkah. And that 9th night should be exclusively for the Shamash, for our helper candle. And it should be to honor all of our helpers in this time of pandemic.
Nice.
Maybe it's a step too far. Maybe it's something that feels radical now, and 10 years from now, it'll be something that we've all embraced, and 200 years from now, somebody will write about it. I don't know. So I put that out there for your consideration and discussion.
So if, Renee, what is your question?
Oh, I was going to ask you again, if you would just go over the political situation that you said was actually what happened in the Jewish community, the political situation.
At the time of the Maccabees?
Yeah.
Okay, so at the time of the Maccabees, the Kohen Gadol, the high priesthood, was, there were several families, priestly families, that were eligible to be the high priest. And they would become the high priest by whoever could bribe the Syrian Greek officials the most. And so it was a bought position. And so the question was who was going to buy it, and one faction, the Hellenistic faction, the ones that wanted to assimilate, bought it, and they were attacked by the others who were not assimilationists, and then the civil war starts between the Jews. And then the Hellenistic faction asks for help from the Syrian Greeks, from Antiochus, and then he comes in, and that's what happens. That was the original history. If I can go back to David's question also about all of the candle restrictions, the way in which, I guess the best way to put it, the way in which halakha develops is it usually goes from simple to complex. And as we mentioned before, there's no mention of lighting a menorah in the books of Maccabees. The next mention of Hanukkah that we have is from a problematic historian called Josephus, who talks about the Hanukkah as the festival of lights, but he doesn't go into any specifics as to what exactly that means. He just calls it the festival of lights. It's not mentioned in the Mishnah, which is the legal code based on the Torah, which is written in 200 after the Common Era, and there are reasons why it's not mentioned in the Mishnah. By the time it gets to the Gemara, then it's a question of you have to light a minimum of 1 candle each night, and then how you light it and where you light it and how high it has to be seen by the street. And then as we go through Jewish history and in the evolution and development of Jewish observance, by the time we get to the law codes of Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, all of a sudden you have all of these, the candles can't be touched, you can't use the light for anything other than beauty. And then you have a shamash, and you actually have discussions that you're really not supposed to use earthenware menorahs because they melt, because of the intense light and of heat from the candles. And so it's better to use metal menorahs. And we go on from there. So the development really becomes much more complex. It's what we call, if you will, the Chumrah of the Month Club, which is these laws tend to get more and more esoterically restrictive until you find yourself so restricted and it doesn't give the festival any room to breathe. And that's a personal opinion shared by an awful lot of liberal thinkers. But Renee, that's the historical context. Hanukkah is it really starts with a civil war between the Jews, and asking the Syrian Greeks to come in is never a good idea. Yes.
So I was wondering what happened to the faction that lost. Were they assimilated into us after being completely defeated, or were they kind of just lost or eliminated or chased out, or what happened to them?
Well, there are different views. One is that they went to the United States and became the Mets. As everyone knows, the Mets are losers, and in fact, they're now the Jets, if I understand correctly. That was said for all you Jet fans. But actually, they hang around. They're not, they become the loyal opposition. And the Maccabees found a dynasty that becomes much more assimilated than the people they were fighting against. So these factions don't disappear, they continue. We believe that these factions end up being what we then later called the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes in some measure, but again, they never get lost. We Jews don't discard anything. I mean, just look at our High Holiday prayer book. We don't discard anything. It's all in there, no matter what.
So what's the next step in the evolution of Hanukkah? Is it the 9th night? Is it the special night for the Shamash for our helper candles? Is it something else?
Well, I'll tell you
Okay,
that.
can I say something to you,
Please.
Julia? Okay, I think this is not a time to make such a decision. Hopefully next year, we will be celebrating together 8 nights, and let's wait and see. That's a pretty drastic measure after all the Jews have been through this, to add another night right now.
And here we have the evolution of Jewish observance, because we find that Jewish observance really takes leaps forward at times of great crisis. And then you have, has anyone ever belonged to a synagogue board? And of course,
Yes.
if I may, my favorite joke applies, which is, how many Jews does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 4. 1 to donate the light bulb, 1 to screw it in, 1 to proclaim that all the Jews stand behind this, and 1 to proclaim that this is the worst thing that ever happened to Judaism, and it will destroy it. And that's exactly how it works. We develop new observances, and sometimes they flourish and sometimes they don't. The best example of this is, how many of you put an orange on your Seder plate? Okay, now there's an apocryphal story, which is definitely not true, very much like Hanukkah. We know it's not true because the person who's attributed in the story says it's not true. And it's Susanna Heschel. Oh, I brought in Heschel, Rabbi Schwarzwald. I actually brought in a Jewish philosopher. So Susanna Heschel is talking about women's rights on the bima in a congregation in Florida. And the president gets up and says, women have as much right to be on the bima as an orange on the Seder plate. So of course, from that point on, feminists or anyone favoring egalitarianism has to put an orange on their Seder plate. Now, ironically, the Orthodox can't do that because the rind of the orange is chametz. Don't ask. When we do Pesach, you can ask why. But that said, there are people who are against it. There are people who are for it. And yet now it's become LGBT. So, and we know from Susanna Heschel that that story never happened. But again, it hasn't stopped anyone from telling it, including me.
And I still put a rock on because you said to do it.
Right, I was going to use that because it actually is getting more and more traction, but that's for Passover, why we put a rock on the Seder plate. So, Rabbi Schwarzwald, any final thoughts?
I thank you for the opportunity. I think that again, the idea to have fried food and chocolate are always good, and light in the darkness is always positive. And as I said, I agree that if we tell different stories as people, as our students are learning and able to handle nuance, and as they are evolving, we also avoid having our teenagers go out and find out the real truth for themselves and then turn around and come back and say, but you only told me about the miracle of the oil. You didn't tell me about the military victory. You didn't tell me about the Civil War. You didn't tell me the truth. So I think it's even that much more important to make sure that we do bring in the nuance as our children are growing up and as they are ready for it.
I must admit, when one of my kids came back, and actually as a teenager came back and said, "You never told us the truth," my response to her was, "Okay, I apologize. Give us back all the presents we've given you all these years. You benefited from what it became." But I would say that Hanukkah, if you're interested in history, Hanukkah is fascinating. If you're interested in celebrations, Hanukkah is fascinating. And if you're interested in the complicated dynamics of the Jewish community, Hanukkah is fascinating. And what I hope for everyone is that it is fascinating, and it's not just rote lighting candles and opening presents and eating latkes, because the meaning behind Hanukkah has saved many, many Jews, or at least their souls, from persecution, and it has gifted them with strong identities. And with that, if there are no final questions, we will thank everyone for coming and wish you a Chag Sameach.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It was very, very interesting.